Eric, I'm going to speak for both of us when I say that Conor is one of our favorite guests, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention a little controversy that happened, and I have a peace offering that actually my boy Benjamin Franklin Esgro is going to offer with me. But to the Iron Cult listeners, the shameful ones who don't listen to every single episode with bated breath and anticipation, can you give just the briefest summary, maybe a minute long, of the Iron Culture Irish potato famine controversy, as best as you can?
You want me or you want Conor to do it? Because I think Conor is probably too emotionally scarred to bring it up.
Yeah, no, and we speak for Conor, so Eric, go ahead.
Okay, so there were rumors that you and I completely made up on our own, that Conor was a potato famine denier. And you know how rumors get started? A couple people say them once, and they kind of spread like wildfire. So just think back to high school, you know? And especially now with social media, these things can really get out of control. Same thing happened here. We brought him on. We on the spot made up a rumor. We kept repeating it. And by no one's fault, it just become kind of this thing that's now associated with him. And he keeps telling us, don't bring it up. It actually does create some stress for me. But rumors, they just kind of like, but again, by no one's fault.
No one's fault.
They get brought up.
Yep.
Certain people repeat them, and they just become part of the cultural zeitgeist. And we're doing our best to fight against that here at Iron Culture, just by letting people know that the rumors are probably false.
Yeah, who's to say, Eric, as we always say, we know the nature of science. Conor, just before we go on, Ben and myself, because we do have an exciting announcement, is there any remark that you want to say in relation to that? Was that at all a misrepresentation of the history up until this point, as you're a historian?
I think as an Irish person, it's probably best for me just to distance myself as much as possible from this conversation and just say that the views of this podcast do not represent the views of this particular participant. I have no money, so I'm not liable for any sort of legal ramifications, and we'll just kind of put a pin in it there, I think.
Okay, so this is what happens because Ben is here, Benjamin Franklin Esgro. We're here today talking about the history of supplements. And we have an exciting development because we're not just here to wash over things and pretend like they didn't happen. In fact, we're here to right the wrongs of the past. And Ben, why don't you just share a development? People probably are aware that I have a supplement company with Ben Esgro called Elemental Formulations. And we currently have a place in America where we do fulfillment. But we wanted to expand. And Ben, why don't you go ahead, man.
So we're taking over your territory. We're expanding into the EU via Ireland. But that is actually serious. We actually are expanding. We're not taking over your territory. We are partnering with a fellow countryman, Gar being from, what is it, City Gym, I believe,
yep.
right?
Limerick.
You're
City Gym.
partnering with Gar?
Bro.
Shout out Gar Ben
in
Limerick.
Yes, exactly. Yep.
He's seen me in my boxers. He was my bodybuilding coach at one point. That's awesome.
No, really? Bro,
That's
look at these
perfect.
intersections.
Small world.
Ireland is freakishly small, though, but that's so exciting.
No,
that's dope.
Yeah, so we actually got manufacturing over there, so we don't have to cross the border, and then they'll be doing fulfillment for all of the EU. So we're hoping that repairs any past traumas or damages.
Yeah.
We can talk about discounts for me later, like mates rates, large quantities. Just give me a vat of creatine and we'll just
just to bathe in it.
All wounds will be healed. Yeah, just leave it outside my house like Homer with the amount of sugar. It'll be fine.
I will say
that's when you know you're an iron cultist, when a vat of creatine repairs all damages ever done previously.
Repairs damages over making light of intergenerational trauma. I will say, in all seriousness, it's been absolutely a dream. Gar, shout out to Gar, and also his best friend, frequent iron cultist. You see the intersecting lines here, Danny Lennon, who they gave us a deal, and Danny said it was a killer deal, and I quote, deal too good to pass up. You really shouldn't pass this up. Seriously, I would hate to see what happens if you don't take this deal. But he's an absolute gem of a human. Gar the same way. And so we wanted to expand. And the hospitality, we remarked, to be serious for a second, myself and Ben, it's remarkable. Like, we haven't experienced it anywhere else. We keep thinking, like, is there a catch? Is there a catch? It's like, man, we're ready to go. Point is, myself and Ben, we're ready to go over to Ireland. It is opening up, elementalformulations.eu, if you're curious for the waiting list for Europe. But we are interested there, and it's just crazy how things happen. So hopefully this makes it up. Connor, I don't know.
I revert back to my amount of creatine argument, and I await all future discussions.
Yeah, it will be made up when there's a vat outside of my house full of creatine.
Don't ask for much.
Hey, that wraps
I think
up
the hardest part for them will be getting a vat rather than the creatine itself. Well, folks, the bit's over. But do look to your
Hey, wait.
your,
That means it's
your
time
local...
for intros, right?
Yeah, we're gonna actually. Yeah, exactly. We gotta intro things. You get it. He knows how it works. You're a podcast veteran now, my friend.
Aficionado.
That's right. But yeah, definitely look to your now new local European creatine slanger elemental formulations, folks. But yeah, this is speaking of supplements. This is going to be a cool conversation. I'm really excited to have Iron Culture frequent guests Ben Esgro and Dr. Conor Heffernan back on to talk about not only the history of the supplement industry via Dr. Heffernan, but also to juxtapose it. That's a Scrabble word for you right there. With the contemporary times that our very own Ben Esgro knows quite a deal about and is enmeshed in on a regular basis. Not to mention that, of course, my co-host, Omar Isuf, you do a little bit of that supplementing as well, don't you?
I've been on them streets. I've slanged some creatine. And now we're going global, as you heard with that announcement. Correct, sir.
Mm-hmm.
Love it. Awesome. So Connor, where do you think we should start with this history of the supplement industry? Because I know that humans have been taking, as we talked about in the last episode with Ben, let's say physiology modifying compounds for a long ass time. But when would you say it actually became like the supplement industry? You know?
Yeah. So there's the early history. Well, there's the early history where people ate bull's testicles in ancient Athens to get, stronger and more aggressive. Funnily, had a friend who was a natural weightlifter who tried that. Doesn't work, kids. So there's the early history. Then there's the early history, and then there's the modern history. I'll start briefly with the early history because it kind of sets out the stall for later on. And when I say early history, I mean like 1890s, early 1900s, with people like Eugen Sandow, Arthur Saxon, Tom Burrows, and a couple of other prototype bodybuilders, CrossFitters, physical culturists, etc. Because the supplements that they were producing didn't last particularly long, but they kind of set out the landscape that was to follow over the next 120, 130 years. So, Eric, you've mentioned this quite a lot. Sandow was a purveyor of cocoa. I'm not sure when cocoa became cacao and vice versa. I just know one is more expensive than the other. But Sandow from 1913 to about 1915 sold a health-boosting cocoa that would build energy, give you greater strength, build your muscle tone, etc. That's not the first thing he promoted. The first thing he promoted was an egg white supplement called Plasmon. And Plasmon's really interesting because this is probably going to blow some minds at least, well, hopefully not just mine. It was an evidence-based protein powder. So it was created in German hospitals in the 1880s to prevent muscle wasting in sick and rehabilitating patients. A group of enterprising British men came together and said, let's buy the rights to that, bring it to Britain, forget about the medicine, because we don't want to help people. We can make more money if we just sell this to people. And then they sold Plasmon as a protein boosting powder. So for the general public, they had a Plasmon cookbook where they were like, hey, add Plasmon to stews, soups, breads, muffins, cookies. Again, thinking in the modern age, protein cookies, protein, well, maybe not soups, protein bars, etc. Then they also got Sandow and other physical culturists to say that Plasmon helped them in every way, shape, and form that you could possibly imagine. So Sandow put his name to claims that he went a whole month just eating Plasmon, and he got stronger and leaner and more muscular than ever before. Sandow claimed that one scoop of Plasmon had the protein or nitrogen or proteid, these are some of the words that they used, content of 5 sirloin steaks or 24 eggs, all in this one scoop of egg white protein powder. He claimed that there was no more nutritious food in the world than Plasmon. We can start to see a pattern emerging even in these early ages. We also have supplements like iron gelloids, which I always like to imagine as like a gummy bear, but instead of like something sweet, it's filled with desiccated liver. I think that's a kid's market that needs to be tapped. But
Mm.
Tom Burrows, an Indian club swinger, not that type of swinger, he swung weighted clubs
Mm.
around for 107 hours. He would claim that, iron gelloids give me the energy to have such strength and endurance to exercise 107 hours without rest. There are other foods and supplements like Bovril, which is still sold, still tastes awful. Arthur Saxon was the one strongman who was pretty upfront that the supplements of his time did nothing. In one of his two books, he says something along the lines of, a lot of people will claim that, certain foods make them stronger or leaner. I take bread, Hovis bread sometimes. It's handy, it's useful. That's about it. I like the taste of it. So not everyone was quite yet playing that supplement marketing game, but we have people like Sandow who obviously he makes his own cocoa or cacao, depending on how bougie one is feeling, from the 1910s. He's tapped into that market very early on. And I think it's just interesting to look at the messages of people like him and Tom Burrows who are giving you that like game changing element to these
Mm.
supplements, especially Sandow, because those messages, bigger, leaner, stronger, I survived just on this, there's no more nutritious food, this is more nutritious than regular food, even though Plasmon, ironically, was one of the few supplements that had a huge amount of literature on it at that time from physicians, from dietitians, and he was still making basis claims. The cynic in me would say that the stall was set, and it took a long time for more, I suppose, people with more integrity to come along to give a very cheap pop to Ben and Omar.
Mm. So I have a question. Plasmon was actually powdered egg whites, basically.
Pretty much, it was, or sorry, it was not powdered egg whites. It was powdered milk. Pardon me. It was a dried milk powder.
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah, so
that's awesome.
similar to what you'd find now in the supermarket. Ironically, before protein powders became popular in the 50s and 60s, a lot of bodybuilders would take dried milk powder in their milk to get a bit more protein, like Reg Park would have talked about it. It doesn't sound as sexy when it's just dried milk powder.
Mhm.
Plasmon, has a little bit more oomph in it.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that sounds like they set the tone for like the next 140 years. Like it's like even in the case, like you said, where it's being used in a clinical situation, and it probably is at the time one of the highest protein content powdered things you can add. It'd be useful in situations where you can't feed traditionally. You could very easily be like, oh, here's some evidence and some real reasons this could be helpful. Nah, let's say that it's better than five steaks. Like, I don't get it. So yeah, I think that that's really intriguing, and I had no idea that protein powder actually went back like more than 100 years. That's pretty sweet.
You know what's
Yeah,
crazy? This is just a real quick interjection. There is, I think, one of the parts that will probably continue to come out in this conversation is that actually some of our most popular and, as we call them now, like evidence-based supplements, they actually have been around longer than you thought. Like
Mm.
creatine, they were aware of creatine in the early 1900s. Like it was some German chemist, I think his name was Justus von Liebig, like great name. But he was studying creatine in like, I think it was before 1910. So it's kind of amazing.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's something. Yeah, there's absolutely a difference between when something is formulated and people are biochemically aware of it, and then when it actually takes hold. And we've talked about this previous in Iron Culture with anabolic steroids, you know. But anyway, so okay, so Sandow kicked it off. Not only is he the godfather of bodybuilding, he's the godfather of the shady ass supplement industry that's always propped it up. So that's amazing to hear. He's always been the whole package. I love it.
synergy all the way around. And I was shocked to hear steroids being mentioned so early on in this discussion, because that is the next great leap in this conversation when we start to see more modern protein powders, etc., being introduced. John Fair and Daniel T. Hall have a wonderful article on this called The Pioneers of Protein. Love the alliteration, which is available freely on Iron Game History. And in that article, they found that the first wave of what we would say modern supplements, the things that were produced by Rio H. Blair, Bob Hoffman, Joe Weider, etc., kind of coalesced around the time that anabolic steroids and Dianabol or vitamin D were first introduced into the fitness industry. And it's interesting because the claims that were made in the 1950s were kind of similar to what Sandow and others were saying. So one of the first great leaps forward, which I now realize saying out loud is very Chairman Mao. One of the move the needle moments, let's be a little bit more apolitical, comes in 1950 when Irvin Johnson, who is later called Rio H. Blair, and we'll probably spend some time talking about Blair, publishes an article in Iron Man magazine called Build Bigger Biceps with Supplements, which kind of does what it says on the tin. And from 1950 to 1952, Irvin Johnson starts selling a high protein powder. It's a soy protein powder. And he's selling it in Iron Man magazine, in Bob Hoffman's Strength and Health magazine. And it's not the first protein powder. Obviously, we've kind of mentioned Plasmon, and there are other derivatives being sold in the 1950s. But it's the first protein powder to like truly captivate the fitness industry, because Irvin Johnson does what Sandow didn't, is he starts to use really impactful transformation stories. So Johnson has a gym in Chicago. He often takes in like predominantly young teenagers, like kind of 14 to 17, who are struggling to build muscle mass or are struggling to even gain weight. And he says, I put them on a program of relatively rudimentary barbell exercises, squats, bench, deadlift, military press, etc. But the game changer was I loaded them up with my high protein powder, and then they gained 20 to 30 to 40 pounds of muscle, in a short period of time. He also trains Mr. American contestants like Jim Park, who again, he claims their successes came from this game-changing high protein powder. Now, 1952, we don't yet have anabolic steroids freely circulating in the bodybuilding community, but we are getting the small steps towards the two kind of coming in together. Interestingly, Johnson is advertising his supplements in Strength and Health magazine. Bob Hoffman, who we've talked about before, he's the American weightlifting coach, manufacturing owner of York Barbell, owner of Strength and Health magazine, often seen as maybe a patron of American weightlifting. He changes his tune when he sees how successful high protein is. He does, and I would not encourage Ben or Omar to do this. Well, maybe actually this is a way to be successful in the supplement industry. Maybe you can correct me. He sees how successful Irvin Johnson is, and he has his eureka light bulb moment, saying he is advertising in my magazines. I have access to his mailing lists. I have access to his customers.
Wow.
I'm going to cut him out. I'm going to market my own high protein powder, Protein, rather than Protein. And he takes over from Irvin Johnson, kicks Irvin Johnson to the curb. Irvin Johnson disappears for several years, reemerges again as Rio H. Blair. We can go into that name change. It's rather fascinating at some point. And from there, Bob Hoffman starts to say, Tommy Kono takes high protein powder, and he's one of the greatest Olympic weightlifters America's ever produced. John Davis takes high protein powder. Later in years, Paul Anderson takes high protein powder, etc. So he has access to the athletes. He has access to the mailing lists. He has access to the media. So Bob Hoffman has, I suppose, what any supplement company would love to have is the captive audience, the sponsored athletes, the means of communication, all within his Strength and Health York Barbell empire. And with that base, he starts to make money and more money and more money and more money. And by the time Dianabol and other steroids are coming into the bodybuilding game in the 50s and 60s, Hoffman's magazines have attuned customers to the idea that this high protein powder will build bigger biceps with supplements. This high protein powder will make me more muscular, will make me stronger. So when they see large, ripped bodybuilders in Strength and Health magazine and Muscle Development and Muscle Builder, there is that tension between, well, is this because of steroids or is this because of high protein powder, this magic, food that's transformational? Is this from fish from the sea, or protein from the sea, which is a fish protein powder that Bob Hoffman sells? Is it from Bob Hoffman's protein fudge bars, which he begins to sell? And actually, I will shut up after this anecdote, but I do love this. The story behind protein fudge by Bob Hoffman is he was in York, Pennsylvania. He was at a local high school football game by himself. Read into that what you will. The team is losing. It loses at the last. Hey, listen, you made it dirty, not me. The team loses the game in the dying moments, and he chats to the coach, and the coach says, we just don't have that vim, vigor, vitality, energy that we need to finish out these games. So being the local man of town that he is, he goes back to his laboratory, which we can go into what that meant in reality, and he makes his protein fudge, goes back to the team. I've made you this strengthening food. You have it, see what happens. They win the next games, they win the local championship. They're all the, I don't know, prom kings, etc. So this is one of the first like stories that he gives for marketing his protein fudge. And then he has stories from other people saying, protein fudge, let me gain 10 pounds of muscle, 15 pounds of muscle in like, a 2-week period. And John Fair has gone through Bob Hoffman's materials. A lot of the testimonials for protein fudge were just typed up by Bob Hoffman in his office at some point, and then slapped on like Ben Esgro or Conor Heffernan or Eric Helms, etc. So the 1950s is really when this kind of soup of protein misinformation begins, and steroids comes at such a wonderful moment for the supplement industry, because it initially Bob Hoffman said, this high protein powder added 15 pounds to someone's total. But no one cares about that, right? You care about aesthetics. So then when you get the clear aesthetic changes, that's when it really starts to ramp up and take off, because you can have these steroid-fueled bodybuilders or steroid-fueled weightlifters, or in time steroid-fueled powerlifters, etc., sponsored by this supplement. And they're saying, and Bob Hoffman is saying, who's very trustworthy, this supplement created, this change.
Well, that's one thing that has gone away. I'm really not aware of any supplement companies in the last 20 or 30 years that have tried to use, enhanced athletes as the figures who claim that their gains came from supplements. I don't know if, Omar, why do you think that died off? Because I really just haven't observed that in our industry.
One word, man: integrity. Everyone just knows. It's like, hey, we're here to make a change. We're here to be impactful. No one's been hyperbolic. No one has fudged testimonials. It's not, Connor, it's totally not due to potentially the fact that the knowledge asymmetry has decreased thanks to the internet, that some of these old practices are potentially being challenged. It's just people having just an overall sense of goodwill towards humanity, saying, hey, these are the mistakes we made in the past. We can do better. Here's Mr. O, who through hard work and, muscle grow, protein 101, got huge. And I think that just like, there's a difference, there's a difference.
The enlightenment's working.
Yeah.
No, but in all seriousness, obviously we're very aware of that practice continuing.
Yeah.
And Connor, going back to what you were saying about the use of the testimonial, and packaging supplements along with like the full package, if you will, where here's the program, here's the supplement, here's the before and afters. You know who I think did that better than anyone else, at least that I'm aware of in the semi-modern age, is Bill Phillips with the EAS. And they had those transformations. Because I remember this when I very first got into lifting. We're talking mid-2000s, was when EAS was a big dog, Myoplex, and they had their... They did such a good job of combining all these things together so that supplements were it's just something you do on the side. Like, yeah, in our supplements, they're like, I remember they had the EAS Sports Supplement Review, which was this very scientifically written review of all the supplements that also included everything they wrote. And then, hey, you can participate in these contests, which are basically like at-home bodybuilding contests. I think they're 8 or 12-week transformations. And the prize was, and I think you had to use at least one EAS supplement, and you could get a money prize, and then you'd get promoted, and and he also has like training programs he would sell and books. So it was just this, I think Body for Life, I think is what it was called, if I recall correctly. But I remember I bought a lot of EAS supplements when I first started, because I never feel like I was being marketed supplements. I thought I was getting just all this good information all together, but I was absolutely being marketed supplements, and it worked. So yeah, it's just interesting where that started and where it goes.
Well, it's interesting because EAS are like a really interesting evolution from the old kind of shyster tactics to kind of sort of moving into that pocket of the supplement industry, which is trying to be science-based, etc., or is actually being science-based. Because it's interesting, Joe Weider, the running joke was that the Weider Labs, so in all the testimonials, it'd be, this mass gainer gives you 50% more muscle gain than any other competitors on the market. Certified, Weider Labs. And I can't remember who it is. It's in one of the Randy Roach books where someone's dream was to work in Weider Labs. And then they eventually got to Joe Weider's headquarters, and Weider Labs, the running joke was that's the broom closet. that's where they kept the mop and the brush, etc. And even Bob Hoffman, John Fair, has a wonderful anecdote about him mixing his high protein powder. And Ben, this will probably make your eyes water. And it's Bob Hoffman standing over a vat, because they do use vats in the supplement industry. So don't give me that talk about how to get a vat of creatine. And he's over a vat with a rowing oar, and he's mixing it himself. So he'd gotten some, unflavored soy protein powder, and he'd poured that into a vat. He then had a big bag of Hershey's chocolate, which he was pouring into the mixture. And every now and then he'd scoop his hand into the mixture, give it a little taste test, and then decide if he needed more protein in it, more Hershey's in it, more sweetener in it, etc. And
More
remarkably,
hand dipped in just to give it that Bob Hoffman flavor.
more hand.
Yeah.
Ironically, every vat was perfectly controlled and tasted the same. Strangest thing.
He just was that finely attuned, Connor. You know what I'm saying? That scoop technology, you can't replace it.
Like the conductor in the orchestra. But like in all seriousness, that's why it's so interesting listening to Ben talking about, stimulants and this kind of pathway in the supplement industry. Because something you mentioned is, the onus is on the producer of these products to be, to have integrity, to do things properly, to manufacture them properly. And like, not that I think anyone's doing that now, but when there is no regulation whatsoever, you can see these really horrid and like jaw-dropping practices being used by Bob Hoffman, who in the 50s and 60s and early 70s is like one of the three main manufacturers who you would buy from. Like Bob Hoffman's protein from the sea and his high protein powder was renowned for producing the most rancid farts that anyone would ever encounter on a gym floor, which, I think collectively we can all say, there's some smells on the gym floor. But people kept taking high protein powder because it must be good because Bob Hoffman's producing it, right? Like he wouldn't lead us astray. So the laxity with manufacturing has produced some very interesting things, from broom closet scientific laboratories to a, by that point, pot-bellied, bald, but nevertheless respectable man dipping his hand in your protein powder, which gives it that extra little bit of spice that you need to get over all those heavy workouts.
I think it's awesome that sometime in the 50s, probably a solid 30% of the weightlifting population of the U.S. Had some parts per million of Bob Hoffman's DNA in their stomach. So if that isn't an amazing thought, I don't know what is. So Ben, I got a question for you, because I think, so the first time I got exposed to this would have been Muscle Tech supplements, where they've got these guys in lab coats. They definitely give the impression that there are labs. There's an R&D department, and this is a pretty serious scientific thing. And then I think it was a few years later that I found out, like, some people were using like their like these small supplement companies were using like their personal bathrooms to like put pills together and mix things. So what is a supplement industry's lab look like? And what's the full gamut of that, from the shady company you probably should not buy anything from to doing it actually properly and legit?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things to touch on there. I was going to say that I don't know what you're talking about, Connor. That whole description of Bob Hoffman is that's just quality control. I don't know what the hell you're talking about. Like, I think there's challenges, because when you look at the pharmaceutical industry, who I guess we could say they set the benchmark for what manufacturing should be, and manufacturing standards and GMP, like that stuff, all those acronyms, they come from pharmaceutical manufacturing. And ideally, that's what a supplement company should be adhering to. There's also like ISO laws, like ISO and all these different numbers and stuff. But they're basically all these regulations that you need to have in place to ensure a clean product is produced and that there's no variation between batches and all that stuff. I think the difficulty is that's expensive stuff. I mean, when you're talking about finding an analyte or testing for potency of something, we can go and send something to a lab that's already established and is being used by drug companies and food companies, and they already have that equipment. But if you're talking about buying that equipment yourself, you're talking about a six-figure investment, and that's not an exaggeration. Like, especially if you need really the most robust testing, like a GCMS, that's over $100,000, especially a good one that's accurate, that is new and is running the right technology. So it's difficult. And if you're a startup or an up and coming, especially in these days, or I'd even say around the 80s or even early 90s, before GMP became really the thing that everybody had to adhere to. To be bluntly honest, I wouldn't be here. There would have been no de novo. There would have been no, well, there'd probably be an elemental at this point, but there would have been no de novo, so no precursor to elemental. And that's actually, I mean, the Bob Hoffman case is definitely an extreme one, where he's not even using PPE or anything to make sure there's no Bob Hoffman getting in the product. But, you know, like the story of Isopure is actually very similar. And that was an inspiration for me. This was two guys in Texas who had a cement mixer, and they were mixing their protein with the cement mixer. Now, I'd like to think that they never used it to mix cement or anything else, but you never know. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to hear how a lot of these companies got their starts that are now very legitimate. I mean, Isopure is owned by Glanbia now. Glanbia is one of the biggest major food manufacturers out there. Yeah, I think it's very interesting to hear a lot of these things that would make us cringe, but they were starting points that allowed some places to get legitimate. But anyway, I think to sort of wrap that up by answering your question, at a minimum, to ensure quality control, you need to have the proper manufacturing equipment. Those are, like, it's either called a ribbon blender that makes sure you get a uniform blend with different ingredients, or like a V blender. And then you need some type of way to analyze it for things like heavy metals, things like potency, things like microbiological assessments. So basically running plates to see if they grow any cultures. So it doesn't need to be a huge, robust lab, but you need to have an actual lab space. But again, last kind of irony in those stories is that still exists. There are still companies calling themselves so-and-so labs. There is no lab to speak of. And I think it's so strange and offensive. And it's just interesting how that whole, I guess, niche has survived and will probably continue to in the fitness industry, as people want to hear that, because it's like it gets you over the hump, but they just need to hear it. They don't need to see it, or they don't need any additional level of validation.
That's really interesting.
I'm sorry. One last anecdote is, so we run, so we have the QC code on our labels. And when you scan that QC, it takes you to the potency test and then the drug-free verification test. And out of my own curiosity, because it's something that we do invest money in, I wanted to see versus our order number versus how many people actually scan that to go and see. And it's disappointingly low. So everybody wants to hear that. Everybody wants to say, are you banned substance free, blah, blah. But the people that actually take that extra step to go and look, it really is disappointingly low.
I mean, I personally just try to buy supplements where I think the probability of having a banned substance is the highest.
Right. You want something that actually works, Eric.
Yeah, but in all seriousness, there was a running joke, and it still exists, that what you should do is you should go to the big exhibitions in the supplement industry and get the sample packets, because the sample packets, they don't have, like, there was this belief that they don't go through the same QC, they don't have a label, they're more likely to be spiked because they want you to try it once and get a really good result. So that's where you get like the pre-workout meth, you know. I don't know if that's true, but I absolutely knew a number of people and who would joke about it on the bodybuilding.com forums back in the day. They'd go to all these exhibitions, go to the expos, and just gather everything and be like, I'm going to have a great 3 weeks of working out. So, yeah.
That sounds, Eric, like pure junkie behavior. We're sanctioning basically addictions where it's like, yeah, man, I mean, if you go there, I mean, I heard there's a supplier there and the supplier has like the best stuff. So you got to be there. I mean, you got to go to the time and you got to make sure you get all the samples. It's like, oh, okay. We're training, right?
Why do I go to the Olympia? No, I don't watch the show. I just really hope that I get a little bit of meth legally.
All I'm picturing is the scenes in The Wire where they're distributing testers in the projects. But in this case, it's someone with like a coat with just like the little sachets of pre-workout, and then just everyone just kind of like...
Yeah, it's basically the same, except the guy has a fake tan and an Under Armour cutoff tee. And he probably tried out for the American Gladiators at some point in the past. And he's the supplier. Yeah.
And it's in an expo center, and there's a line looped around that one little booth, or those multiple booths. Yeah,
I'm gonna say
that explains.
yeah, but I'm gonna say the cruelest thing I'm gonna say, but to me it represents some of the saddest aspects of humanity, where it's like you're waiting in line. Like just think about how much or how little you value your time. You go to the expo, cool. You want to experience this. You want to be part of the culture. I dig it. I dig it. I dig it. I dig it. You want to get a free sample. What is the low estimate of time it would take for the big, like let's say the big booths, to actually get the free sample? An hour, 2 hours, 3 hours? It's the equivalent. The actual retail value, because it's a scoop, would be $1 or $2. So you're waiting in line 1, 2, 3. If it's, let's say you got like Mr. O there, so there's also a personality. You're waiting 2 to 4 hours to get $1 to $2 worth of something for free, and that's in relation then to your how much you value your time. Man, come on.
It is crazy to think about that. I mean, I think every time I've been at the Arnold, like I've walked through and I opened the door to the expo and then turned right around and walked back out. Because I mean, it's not just that you're in line forever; it's that you're shoulder to shoulder. It's like being in the worst possible college bar of your life, and then being stuck. Because it's not just that you're in line, but you are stuck. Then once you get in the middle of it, you can't get out. And maybe that's part of the problem is the traffic jam. People don't want to be there anymore, and they're just wedged between 250-pound guys. I don't know.
I'm right there with you, Ben. Expos and me don't mix. And if I wait in a line that's longer than 30 minutes, the other side of it better be Space Mountain. That's all I gotta say. If you give me a packet of stuff that might make me fail my next urine test when I compete, that probably wasn't worth it for me. But to each their own.
So to be in danger of temporarily derailing the conversation by going back to the history of
by going back to the topic of the podcast,
guys, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
God, that's why we need an adult in the room,
No,
Connor. That's why we have you.
Oh God, listen, the wheels have gone if I'm the adult in the room. But just something on expos and kind of on supplements and people wanting like the biggest doses. Another element that's quite interesting from the 1950s and 60s is really the origins of megadosing. Megadosing vitamins and minerals. That doesn't necessarily have its origins in the fitness industry per se, although Bob Hoffman, Rio H. Blair, and other individuals are doing that. But that becomes more prominent after Linus Pauling, who's a Nobel Prize winning physicist. I think. Am I right, Ben? He's a physicist?
Chemist, yeah, the whole vitamin C thing. Yeah, he's responsible for the idea of electronegativity, which is very, very important in knowing how molecules react. I'm done. Continue. I don't want to derail us again.
I feel like you have a bigger handle on this, but Linus Pauling in the 50s and 60s becomes very famous for kind of creating a linkage that, mega dosing, taking huge amounts of vitamin C is beneficial to your health. And this is kind of, we still have the aftermath of that, in the like, oh, I feel a cold coming on, I'm going to take my vitamin C, etc. But Linus Pauling, adds that respectability. He adds that like scientific interest amongst the general public in what can vitamins and minerals do for me. And for the supplement industry and the fitness industry, this is like the best thing in the world that we can say, if we have 200% the RDA of vitamin B or, vitamin B12 or whatever, that this is more healthy for you, that this is healthier, that this will lead to improved or enhanced health. And it's interesting that in America, the FDA, who's nominally in charge of regulating this at that time, by 1966 is coming out, nominally, I said nominally, by 1966 it's coming out and saying that there is no benefit whatsoever to supplements in your diet. And by the mid to late 1970s, the FDA actually tries to put forward a law in which supplement suppliers could not put in more than 150% the RDA. And if it was over 150%, a doctor would have to prescribe it for the individual in question. Now, I don't think that was necessarily the best idea, given all of the major issues we have with, say, nutritional knowledge amongst physicians, etc., and also the specification for athletes. But it is interesting that the problem had gotten so bad within a decade of kind of Linus Pauling promoting megadosing that the FDA was saying, we want doctors to write prescriptions for vitamins and minerals, etc., because we are now concerned with the huge amounts that are being put into these supplements to make them healthier, etc., and the people who are taking them, because it's also tied into alternative health, to cure illnesses, because this has 1,000% my RDA of vitamin C. It must help me cure insert illness here. if it's constipation, it probably will be of great benefit to oneself. But for the supplement industry, we can see that again, we have in the 60s and early 70s, we have supplements being sold, we have steroids coming into the industry, we have megadosing becoming like quite a popular concept and ideology, and that all of these things kind of coalesce together to bring us to the point where you're in an expo at the Arnold, surrounded by sweaty people, queuing up to get, whatever the muscle builder or pre-workout du jour is, because it has all of these great ingredients within it. So a lot of the issues that we have today, again, we can kind of trace back to the 60s and 70s. Again, I'm done being an adult now, so we can talk about vitamin C shits if we want.
No, like I think we could, but I think that just saying those words together is enough for the listener. We're
good. Okay.
We got a very imaginative iron cultists listening, but yeah, that's megadosing is still something that is very common. I remember when there was these very preliminary speculative links in the community as to the effect of vitamin D, and next thing you knew, there were a number of prominent amateur bodybuilders like, "Yep, 10,000 IUs a day," and swearing by it too. And I remember nearly getting on that train and thinking, I'll just do 5,000. I'll be reasonable, which in retrospect, still a lot, just not as much as too much. So, or it probably still was too much. Still too much, but just not quite as much as twice that. So anyway, it still happens all the time. And I think a lot of supplement industries, like it's baked into their process. Like I think creatine loading is mostly a useless practice, but it is basically megadosing for a period of time. And yeah, of course, it does create uptake. But if you're going to take this thing for the next 2 decades, do we really care that you got to topped off levels of muscle creatine 4 days earlier? I don't know. So it just seems like it is very much baked into the culture now.
Even just human psychology. I mean, yeah. I think the basic way people approach something is if some is good, then more is better. I mean, I've had that conversation so many times with people trying to evaluate or compare supplements, and they say, well, this has 20 or 30 things, and yours has 4. How can yours be better? I think people, and we just need to look at the situation objectively. I think the desire of most brands is to make something that's going to sell, not necessarily something that's going to be best for their consumer. And if the consumer demands it, they'll keep making it. It's just the bottom line. And I do think that's sort of the rudimentary logic of looking at or evaluating things is like this. Oh my God, it's got 1,000%. I don't need to eat anything else with vitamin D for the day. Unfortunately, that still exists. Just like you say, we just push it to the new thing, like it was vitamin D, and then we still see in every formula, like vitamin B is still at 500, 1,000%, and you're just making expensive piss, but people still want it.
If my pee doesn't have unique colors every morning, Ben, then I just feel like that pee was a waste, personally.
Exactly.
I was going to ask Ben, there must be such a temptation because for the general public, for the last 50 years, we've been told more is better. And if 100% is good, 500% must be amazing, right? And that's really what's kind of as a baked in from the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't want to elaborate too much on that because I know we have a couple of decades to get through of kind of how we arrived here. But I think the real quick answer to that is I do think there is somewhat of a walking on glass aspect to what we're applying that to now with stimulants, because that's really the new thing is how high can we go in caffeine? And that's where the competition has sort of evolved to.
Yeah. As a quick aside, Conor, we actually have the real world data, myself and Ben, from our company where we try to market them equally. We had a base pre-workout, then the prime pre-workout. Prime pre-workout was for athletes. It has a little bit more caffeine, plus some other actives that definitely, might make it more lucrative, but it's also more expensive. It's what was it, 30 or 40% more expensive, but we try to market them equally. We gave them kind of an equal platform, spoke about it. I myself, because I'm kind of like Ben and kind of like Eric too, I would use the base pre, so the more cost-effective, more simple one. So we described it as being economical, all these things. So it definitely got enough play. It wasn't like we weren't thrusting it forward. But when we looked at the sales feedback, when you talk about trying to make these choices, it sold maybe 15, 20%, as well as the Prime pre-workout. So when we talk about real world data and we're trying to survive as a supplement company and trying to make these choices, well, it kind of becomes clear what you're going to focus on then. So the more is more one. And I do think there is a culture in lifting in our society as a whole, the more is better, of course. And that within lifting especially too, that if you're just doing kind of an apples to oranges, it's like, well, this one has more stimulants. It's like, well, why wouldn't I use that? Well, wait a second. Well, why wouldn't it be better in all situations? Like, well, I don't know. You're working up to an RPE7 today, like 200 milligrams of caffeine is good for you right now, dude. Like, you're not crushing it in this workout. But you can't tell people, even when you tell, people that, and you let them make their free choice, you see what happens.
Yeah, on that, and I won't name names, but a friend of mine who unfortunately was hit by a lightning bolt when he was born because he has the genetics of a Greek god. He won't work out until his heart feels like it's basically pumping out of his chest.
Sure.
So this is where it goes on to like malpractice, like dry scooping, etc. But
Yeah.
you know, bully for him. Let's see if he makes it to his 60s. That is the bitterness in me coming because when he wanted to bulk up as a teenager, he put weight gainer on his KFC ice cream and kept his abs.
Damn.
So
elite of
right,
the elite, Connor.
I'm entitled to be a little bit bitter. But so it's interesting because when we were talking, I pulled up a Vince Gironda diet from the 70s and early 80s. And for people who don't know, Vince Gironda was one of the most influential bodybuilding trainers of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, known for being very crotchety. His first interaction with Arnold Schwarzenegger, he told him that he was a fat F word and needed to lose weight. This is after, it's like, oh, we have this Austrian bodybuilder coming in. We see great things in him. We think he's going to be the next Mr. O. That was Gironda's first interaction with him. He helped train Larry Scott, the first Mr. Olympia champion, 65 and 66. Gironda was outspokenly against anabolic steroids. Obviously, a lot of his trainers took anabolic steroids, but his whole thing was supplements will produce steroid-like results if taken in the right quantities and if taken in huge amounts. So in his Vince Gironda mail order course, in some of his books, which are still available, like I think it's Unleashing the Wild Physique, Unleashing the Wild Physique, you can see his, protein balancing diets, his Stone Age nutrition diets. But I came across his supplement list for his weight gain diet, and there is a wonderful anecdote about Vince Gironda, writing out a diet plan for someone and then handing them like little doggy bags filled with pills and then saying, "This is your real diet now." So for one day, the supplements are vitamin B complex, vitamin C complex, 3 vitamin E capsules, 10 alfalfa tablets, 10 kelp tablets, 3 trigerm and wheat oil capsules, 1 halibut oil capsule, 1 hypothalamus tablet, 1 hypozyme tablet, 3 hydrochloric acid tablets before a meal, 3 digestive enzymes tablets after a meal, 1 lipotropic tablet, 4 calcium tablets, 1 zinc tablet with PABA amino benzoic acid, 3 lysine tablets, and then 3 multigranular tablets. And that'll top you off for your meal in between breakfast and lunch. Between lunch and dinner, you take an iron tablet, 4 calcium tablets, and then the same as breakfast, but you take out the vitamin E, the trigerm wheat oil, and the halibut tablets. Then you take even more supplements after dinner. And then just during the day, you take desiccated liver, some yeast tablets, some arginine, and then some tryptophan as well before retiring. So we can see that by the early 70s to early 80s, supplements haven't just entered the fitness industry, the practice of taking huge amounts of supplements, because I haven't even mentioned what he said about protein powder in that, have entered the fitness industry, but they've become like a cornerstone of the fitness industry because Vince Gironda, one of the most respected bodybuilding coaches, who often said, like, I have no skin in the game. He was, I say this respectfully, he was just a coach who sold workout courses. He wasn't selling supplements, he wasn't selling magazines, etc. And he was saying, take all of these supplements and take them at specific times a day. This will build your quote unquote wild physique. This will make you muscular. Then you open up a Joe Weider mag and he has Arnold Schwarzenegger or Lee Haney or whoever is the bodybuilder du jour saying the exact same thing. You open up a Bob Hoffman mag, who's Joe Weider's rival. They're saying the same thing. Even Perry Rader of Iron Man magazine, which is often seen as the neutral magazine between Weider and Hoffman, he has people selling supplements in there like Rio H. Blair, whose protein powder he calls mother's milk. Just let that drop settle in for a minute. He said that his protein powder mixed with raw cream had the anabolic properties of mother's milk. And I cannot say the word mother's milk without saying it in a very creepy voice, like mother's milk. But this is,
that's a new trend. That's a new trend.
What,
it was on Netflix, right?
Yeah,
There was a Netflix documentary about it.
There are people who will go out of their way, many in the bodybuilding community, to get breast milk.
Well, let's just say two things. One, babies do double in size in a few months, so it's kind of hard to argue with the anecdotes. And two, if you want to, just remember, this is a podcast, folks. You can rewind it and play that over and over again if you want to get the Vince Gironda stack. That's probably what we'd recommend as our just stock standard for entry-level bodybuilders.
Entry, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
On the modern trend of breast milk, as someone who's a lifelong natural and whatever you do is your own business, etc., there's rarely a situation where I would say it probably makes more sense just to go on steroids than trying to track down breast milk and take it away from mothers who need it. But I mean, no judgment, no judgment zone. But it is interesting that it's so embedded, and you can see we haven't even talked about pre-workouts, which come in the early 1980s, creatine, which starts to be marketed in the 1990s, the latest iteration of pre-workouts, protein bars, etc. But by the 1980s, your protein powders, vitamin mineral extracts, many of which we no longer use, like things like choline and inositol, people don't really use that much. Even desiccated liver has kind of fallen by the wayside. Same with wheat germ oil and molasses. Some of the other supplements that are being used at that time. It's just so integral to people's diets at that time. And the internet and especially Instagram has had some interesting turns on fitness communities, but at least there is good information out there now. The magazines at that time are always going to be pushing new and weird and wonderful supplements in the 70s and 80s. And this is before we get the advance of pre-workouts and creatine, etc.
I remember reading, I used to, because I think like many, my first exposure to like the competitive side of bodybuilding was pumping iron. And I very quickly fell in love with the era of those guys. And I wanted to do what the old school guys did because I like their physiques better. And I remember trying to find liver tabs in the mid 2000s, and they weren't really a thing anymore. Like people were like, what are you talking about? But because that's all those dudes would talk about if you read their old articles, is like how many liver tabs they were taking per day. And I don't even remember if I had a logical reason beside the fact that all the dudes in the 70s were taking it. I probably didn't. So
I tried to track down the same thing, and then I also tried to track down Rio H. Blair's protein, because I was like, Frank Zane is talking about this protein powder like it's amazing. This is what I need to turn my Irish physique into Frank Zane's. I couldn't find the protein powder, so that's obviously my excuse.
yeah, this will make my clavicles broader and my tibias shorter if I just take these liver tabs, was basically what I thought at the time, whether I realized it or not. So, yeah.
I think, Connor, one of the things that you sort of touched on there, and this is, from my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that was really where the concept of stacks came out too, and started to become popularized by again, this was, I was born in the 80s, but so obviously I wasn't a supplement consumer yet, but from
breast milk.
Yes, I was a breastfed baby, so that I attribute all of my mediocre success in bodybuilding to that. But I know the big three at that time seemed to be like Universal, Beverly, and Twin Lab. And I know you said you're going to touch on, where the first pre-workout came in, and I know that was around the time of the ephedra and everything. But Universal owns Animal, and Animal Pack and Animal Stack was one of their initial products, and it's still around. So I guess it's kind of interesting to think about. Stacks really started, to my knowledge, in the 80s, where still that's like a very common thing, is like you need to buy the protein and then the post-workout powder and then the creatine and then the 9 other things, and you could buy it all as a stack.
And I think it's interesting that it's in the 80s that it starts to come together in one bundle, because prior to that, like Rio H. Blair, he sells vitamins and minerals and protein powders and iodine tablets and kelp tablets and alfalfa tablets and weird and wonderful things that have really... There's a great article or podcast to be done on the supplements that time forgot, but he's selling them individually and he's saying for different reasons, etc. And like Animal Pack and Animal Stack do that wonderful thing of saying, oh, this just covers everything. This is the CYA, the cover your ass stack. So yeah, it is in the 80s that it becomes more of a thing, whereas in the 60s and 70s, all of these things are being sold, but it's almost like a prescription. For Vince Gironda, his muscle gain diet had different supplements to his weight loss diet, had different supplements to his steak and eggs diet, etc. So yeah, you are right. It is in the 1980s that starts to coalesce around here's the one thing that just covers, muscle gain, fine, maintenance, fine, weight loss, fine. This will cover it all. Whereas prior to that, it is specific to one's purpose, and it's not as joined up. It hasn't, like, they're marketing a lot and they're very cynical, but they haven't quite made that leap into it yet, which I think, yeah, it's a really interesting point to consider.
I think the interesting part is while we'd look at the 50s or the early 1900s and say, oh, like stuff has gotten so much more advanced technologically and everything. I actually think the logic of that time is better, to take things individually versus the stacked concept, because you still see today, like there's a BCA product that has green tea for nighttime fat loss or something, and it's just so, like, it actually, the marketing, like it or not, the marketing is what I think broadly educates the consumer base. And I actually think if we rewinded a little bit of our mindset towards supplements, we'd probably have more success with using them, to the old, almost ironically to what you were saying, Eric, to the old time mindset of how supplements were marketed. But unfortunately, marketing is more about a story than it is about truth.
Absolutely. Marketing is a story, even when it does contain truth, because it's still using that truth to accomplish something, right? And to tell you a story.
Yeah, and actually on that, it is interesting to maybe start to, walk towards the 1980s and more recent times. The story behind one of the, I suppose, first pre-workout supplements, like, leans so heavily on that it's toppling over the backstory of its manufacturer. And I'm talking about Ultimate Orange, which I actually managed to get a little taste of Ultimate Orange in the early 2000s.
Get out of here.
Someone had a little bit of it in their room. Like mid-teens, realistically, it was one of the banned batches, so I probably shouldn't have been given that. But in any case, for people who are unaware, Ultimate Orange was the pre-workout powder, the kind of one of the precursing, one of the first major pre-workout powders, produced by Dan Duchesne of the Underground Steroid Handbook fame, of the multiple stints in prison fame, of the Body Opus diet fame, etc. Like, so if anyone's interested, Dan Rosenke has just written a dissertation. It's available online at the UT Austin website on drug suppliers in the 1980s. He has some really interesting research on Dan Duchesne. Like, I say it in jest, but he is probably one of the most important figures of the 1980s, especially in the proliferation of anabolic steroids in the fitness industry, because he effectively makes a steroids for dummies handbook, which becomes, like, very coveted and is, read in gyms throughout the world. But one of his legitimate streams, aside from writing for magazines, writing the Body Opus diet, which is still one of the most confusing cyclical ketogenic diets I've ever encountered, is producing Ultimate Orange, this pre-workout powder. And some of the advertisements for Ultimate Orange in the 1980s are effectively all along the lines of, like, I can't believe it's still legal. And, there's images of Dan Duchesne on the front of it saying, like, this is certified legal, like, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And obviously, Ultimate Orange is a very problematic supplement. Maybe, Ben, you can talk a little bit more on that. I'll just talk about the multiple times it was pulled off market, brought back to market. You can still actually access some of the FDA files on Ultimate Orange, in which, there are the cases brought forward by individuals who said, my son took this and he had a heart attack on the treadmill, etc. Like, one of the advertisements which I pulled up here is, Duchesne swears Ultimate Orange contains no, underlined, illegal compounds. And then there's Duchesne with a very, very knowing grin looking into the camera. So Ultimate Orange really does play on that story of Dan Duchesne. This is the guy who gets results no matter what. This is the guy who knows chemicals and chemical compounds better than anyone else, because he's not one of the first people to talk about steroids in the fitness industry. Like, Iron Man magazine have articles from the 1970s saying, are we abusing steroids too much? I guess the answer was no, given trends after that. But, Duchesne is that outspoken bad boy of the evidence-based community, which, for the 1980s. And he is guaranteeing that there's no underlined illegal substances in Ultimate Orange. So that marketing story is really beneficial, because, like, the people queuing up at the Arnold because they might get the supplement with the meth in it, Ultimate Orange is kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudging you all along the way.
Yeah, I'm not aware of what else banned would have been in it. I do know at that time that it did contain ephedra. It was an ephedra caffeine, and at that time ephedra wasn't banned. But really, I think the gist of what I know about it is really that was the first quote pre-workout, the first introduction of a new type of product into supplements, and most people attribute that as being the first pre-workout. And then I think that's kind of what started into that 90s period. That and probably Twin Labs Ripped Fuel, which was also an ephedra-based fat burner. I think that was when they started to take the shift into sort of the new era of the 90s. But I'm sure we'll talk about creatine a little bit. And you already mentioned Bill Phillips. I know Bill Phillips' name came up as well. I think that was, and it'll be interesting to talk about how that transitions into where we are now. But I do think that was really a distinctive kind of inflection point or turning period where it shifted away from just looking at proteins and, you know, these natural food-based anabolics. Then we really started to get into almost like the chemistry or the pharmacology of supplements rather than the nutritional supplements that were food-based. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think an important point on that is, you know, by the 1980s, not that Joe Weider et al. Had like run out of supplements to promote, but there was a sense of like there's only so many like acids and vitamins and minerals that we can promote. Like there's a wonderful article, and it's available freely on my website, called "The Workouts and Diets of Bodybuilding Champions." It's from an Ironman magazine in 1991, and Lee Haney's supplements and some of the supplements that people talk about in it, like I can't recognize half of them. Like there's frac, which is ferulic acid. I don't even know if I said that right. Choline, inositol, herbal extracts such as Similac, and then some of his cohorts are saying L-carnitine is supposed to still use choline and inositol. So like there is a sense in the like late 80s, early 90s that like we need to get something different because, you know, we are kind of running out. Like we don't have something that's really going to make a difference. And like creatine, which starts to be marketed in the early 90s, that is a game changer and it seems to make a difference. And also, ironically, within the fitness community, not so much among the general public, creatine is promoted by many individuals as having like steroid-like effects. So there is the moral panic around creatine in the 90s and early 2000s that creatine is another steroid. Ironically, at least in Ireland and Europe, pro hormones got less bad press than creatine did.
Wow.
So I know people who are pushed away from creatine towards pro hormones because creatine is a steroid.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so like it is interesting. I think vitamins and mineral extracts, they don't have enough, I suppose, oomph anymore by the 1980s. So there is a hunger and a demand on the part of manufacturers to find something that will, you know, have a tangible effect. And like it is interesting, you know, there are stories of certain pre-workouts being sold in the 1980s, which are largely hokum, but they put in flushing niacin in it. So when you go to the gym, right, you know, you get the tingle, you get sensation, you might get the flushing. So it must be working, right? Because it's going to have that impact on the body. But I think, yeah, things like Ultimate Orange and the first wave of pre-workouts, which ironically for a Duchenne supplement turned out to be relatively mild, given what happened with some of the manufacturers of pre-workouts in later years. Not often, I can say, Duchenne was quite weak in his potions, but nevertheless, you know, you have Ultimate Orange, you have creatine, especially around the early 90s. These are the kind of move the needle moments in the fitness industry because A, you can combine the two and have wonderful results, but B, they are seen as more scientific, more advanced, you know, not your dad's supplements effectively, or like not your mom's supplements, whereas your, you know, mom and dad who were lifting in the 50s, 60s, and 70s had protein powder and weight gain powder and vitamins and minerals. The new generation of lifters have science-backed pre-workouts, even if that scientist happens to be the underground drug guru, or science-backed, you know, creatine powders, etc. So it is interesting. There is that, I would say, shift from, as you said, Ben, like the natural substances, quote unquote, because the production processes weren't always up to par, into that chemical scientific moment, even if that moment wasn't maybe as rigorous in production as one would like. Like there is that shift towards the science basis.
Connor, what I was going to say real quick is that kind of what Ben was alluding to, it almost feels like an inflection point too, where it's a diverging path between before we're talking about vitamins, minerals, fitness kind of being synonymous with health, or assuming that one wants to pursue some sort of aspect of health. Like this is something that's enabling you to not only be stronger, but like, look, it's vitamins, it's minerals. And then here we're talking about Dan Duchesne, dangerous Dan here, science at the forefront. So we're not just talking about, biology, things that are found within nature. It's like we're superseding almost nature now. And some of maybe the aspects of lifting in general, where it's like, well, more is better. Well, let's be on the bleeding edge here. It's like, well, we're freaks here. We're willing to throw our bodies at the wind in order to get them gains. And I don't think maybe the health aspect, which would be a separate slice in the supplement space, would come back much later. And it's a different branching path that people like, I want to optimize my health. But it is kind of funny, Ben. Yeah, I want to hear your opinion, man, because we've seen Ultimate Orange. I just also wanted to say too, I think that's a brilliant marketing, the name. I know it sounds like, what the fuck, Ultimate Orange, but just think about it, right? It sounds synthetic. Ultimate, of course, right? Great adjective there. Orange, where we're talking about right here, that this color, it's like, what does that color even mean? It just sounds different, as opposed to when you said Lee Haney listing off his 1991 article, was like, these just sound like, yeah, amino acids, compounds, whatever, like doses, or maybe things that you might be familiar with on a cursory level in other places where you're taking, you're taking higher doses of vitamins and minerals. But Ultimate Orange, science, is this dangerous? Is this even legal? Where's this being manufactured? In a lab? What's going on here, Ben?
Yeah, I think something I do want to mention that I think people, well, anybody who's really interested in the conversation should look into is there's a movie that came out, I think, a year ago called Sups. It's called Sups the movie. It's the only platform I'm aware of it being on is Amazon Prime, but it actually does a really good job of talking about this history, and not just the products that came out, but actually what was going on culturally at that time. And it talks a lot about the marketing. And I will say Conor's job was much more thorough. So if you want something as thorough as Conor's, you're going to be a little bit let down. But it does a good job of giving some of the visuals and some of the weeder and the interpersonal things, and talking about how Arnold and all those influences came in on things. But I think, to bring it back to the point, I do think a lot of these eras are defined by one sort of common principle. And I do think you nailed it, Omar. I think really leading up to the 80s, it was defined by optimizing human. And then in the 80s, marketing and everything else took this shift to being superhuman. And I think that's when we really wanted to, or people seem to be interested in, not so much is this as healthy, or can it get me to be bigger than everybody else, or something that nobody else can attain. And if you look at the physiques, that's really where they took that, that major jump and change too. But yeah, I think again, leading up to 50s, 60s, they were defined by proteins and stuff like that. And then 80s was more vitamin stacks, and then talking about introduction of things like ephedra. And then really 90s was, in my opinion, what would be defined by really three things: creatine, ephedra, and andro. So Conor, I don't know if you want to delve into that too much either, but I do think that really transitions us very much into the 2000s and formulation today, because I think so much of what we talked about, it really, the more recent stuff we talked about, it has had this wake of impact that still carries on today. But in my opinion, really, ephedra and andro were the two major ones that still we're feeling some type of impact from.
And I think it's interesting. At various points, we've all touched on the physiques, and certainly Omar, Ben, and Eric, you've even mentioned it. We looked at the bodybuilders of the age are actually such a wonderful litmus test for what the supplements of the age are like, because the 80s and 90s, the 80s in general is a wonderfully interesting cultural point in which fitness becomes normalized. Like pumping iron is having an effect. Jane Fonda workouts are having an effect. Richard Simmons, who I love that guy, he's a beacon of positivity, is having an effect. It's becoming normalized to go to the gym, but there is that no pain, no gain mantra for the general public, which in bodybuilding is muscle at all cost. And there is that wonderful book written by Sam Fuso, Confessions, I think is the story of an unlikely bodybuilder or something along those lines, where he talks about becoming an amateur bodybuilder, and just the ethos of bodybuilding in the 80s and 90s is not health. Like if you read a Frank Zane article or book even today. The whole thing is optimizing health the whole way through. And that really was, for his era, one of the concerns. It's freak show, it's mass monster, it is big, freaky, veiny, muscular. And like Dorian Yates embodies that in the early 1990s, to the point where Arnold Schwarzenegger is coming out and openly criticizing Dorian Yates for being too muscular, for having a bubble gut, etc. Dorian Yates is saying that I am, just an evolution on what your generation was. This is what people want now. And people have a foot in each camp in those debates. But within the general prevalency of bodybuilding, things like diuretics, things like tren, etc., things like the use of insulin, create these freakish bodies that are not defined by health. And that starts to influence supplement marketing and messaging as well, where it is about what your next PR is going to be, how much muscle will this help me gain, slapping Ronnie Coleman on the creatine powder and saying it's 24 times more powerful than the average creatine, for example, to pick a random example from my head. And you're right, I think things like Ephedra and Andro, like that is buying into the, well, I don't care about my health, I just want to be ripped, I want to be more muscular, etc. I now want that freakish result. And I mean, the starting to turn the dial up on what's in a pre-workout at the turn of the 90s into 2000s, it is buying into, because if you look at a lot of the videos are on YouTube, a lot of the ads are still available on Google. The typical typical pre-workout or creatine ad from the early 2000s, most of them are like a ripped dude with a woman in a bikini for some reason, like tearing his shirt off, or he's in a lab and he has like monster eyes, or he's breaking a chain, or it's like Branch Warren banging out some dips with loads of chains around his neck and it's black and white and he looks like he could beat you up through the image itself. Like that delve and celebration into freakishness. And like Animal Pack and Animal Stock, like just to go back to them, had some of them like the best like copy in the fitness industry in their ads. And it was all about like, hardcore. You're an animal, it doesn't matter, it's hardcore, you're training on Christmas because F your kids, they don't get it. You're in the gym. So I think that delving and celebration of freakiness, of counterculture, of like the hardcore lifter has an impact on the supplements because they're responding to and fueling that identity. And then the products that are going into these supplements, like Ephedra, etc., are fueling that as well, literally fueling that as well. So there is that wonderful intersection between what sports like bodybuilding, and it's not just bodybuilding, because powerlifters, my goodness, are pushing the boundary again and again and again and again, and there's a celebration of the hardcore lifter in that. The strength, the sport of strongman and strongwoman is bigger, faster, stronger again and again and again. There is that push to extremes that I think, opens a pathway for, I don't care what's in the pre-workout, right? Because I got a PR in the gym. Like, we all know when a pre-workout is banned initially because it has an illegal substance in it, there is a run on that pre-workout on eBay and other sites because people want that, because that's definitely going to get me to where I need to be. And I think, culturally, the 80s and 90s is really important for legitimizing I don't care about health, I care about strength, or I care about aesthetics. Get me there as quick as possible.
Yeah, I can say as a someone who was hook, line, and sinker bought in as a consumer in the mid and early 2000s, there were two very distinct types of people who might be taking a whole pill case of supplements. You had the people who were health nuts, and they would take some similar but mostly very different supplements than the bodybuilder who had the pill case of other stuff. I remember being on the bodybuilding side of it. I would specifically, I had this belief, which is the exact opposite of what I have now, is that if I knew what the supplement was, it probably wasn't that effective. Like, it needs to sound like a chemical I'm unfamiliar with. It needs to be something secret. Like, it's a vitamin. Oh, it's an amino acid. Lame. Like, is this gonna, I need something that has steroid-like gains, And now it's funny today, if I see something and I don't know what it is, I think it's either like some kind of trademark fake name on something that doesn't work, or it's some experimental thing with no research on it. I'm like, okay, I don't know what that is. Like, where's my staples, as a researcher, which is just a very interesting inversion of where I was at when I was molded by the marketing rather than molded by my own, critical thinking. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think there's been a cultural inversion as well, though, because even as you say that, I'm thinking like, in the 50s and 60s, that was really when we were like, people bought home chemistry sets. It was a normal. You could go into a drugstore and you could buy reagents and chemicals from a drugstore. And now the culture is chemophobic. Like, I think in general, the average consumer, if they can't pronounce the name on the back of the label, even if it's some type of flavor, they won't buy it. And I do think in that time, 80s, 90s, people didn't so much have that mentality. Maybe it was the beginnings of it, but I almost think you get pushed so far until you reach that spillover point where it starts to, like you said, it starts to have an inversion effect. And who knows, maybe that's just the natural response to how far we did come with the advancement of chemistry and Teflon and, all these synthetic flavors and everything else. Yeah, it's just kind of fascinating. I was thinking that as you said that, is like, it wasn't just you. I think there's definitely a cultural thing that correlates with that.
I think it's a pendulum swing, like we were talking earlier. And Connor was talking about how we went from having these massive lists of kind of like the DIY supplement list that you'd have to take for things in the 70s and 80s to then, all right, this is too much. Just give me the all-in-one. Give me the super supplement. And I remember the stuff in the 2000s and early 2000s and mid 2000s, even later, were the super supplement. Like Anaconda is an example in more contemporary times. But there were examples of that even before that, where it'd be like, hey, we have creatine, we have HMB, we have caffeine, we have glutamine, and they're all in one. This supplement is everything the supplement industry could ever promise in one, and it only costs some ridiculous amount of money. And I remember being attracted to those because I was overwhelmed by the supplement industry in general. So I think that probably happened at a societal level over decades.
Yeah, and the power of disillusionment should not be, and like fatigue on the part of consumers is really important, because like people initially like celebrated, like Dan Duchesne, the steroid guys, make my pre-workout, this is going to be good. Like by the late 90s, early 2000s, when like Victor Conte is making ZMA and then he's getting busted in a steroid trial, or like pro hormones are legal, but now they're not legal. And is this herbal extract that I've never heard of going to give me heart palpitations and increase my anxiety because they're mega dosing this mythical substance? I mean, things like examine.com, I mean, the voice that the internet gave to evidence-based researchers, I think led to, or, for some pockets of the fitness community, because, hey, like, it still exists. I'm one of them in the fitness space when it comes to supplements and workouts, etc. But I think the disillusionment with the marketing, the disillusionment with I've bought expensive pee, has led more to like, well, is this effective? Like, and I think Examine for a lot of the general public was like really transformative, because I don't need to actually understand the science behind it, but there's a really cool scale. It's a little pyramid and it has like 4 levels on the pyramid. So this is probably going to work and this isn't going to work. And I think the disillusionment, the fact that actually maybe the marketing pushed people too far, that they were tired, they're like, I don't know what to buy, I don't know what I want, has led to some really interesting pathways, because then you do get supplement businesses which are like, no, we're legit, and not in a like Joe Weider, don't check the labs, they might get hit with a broom, wink, wink, sort of legit, but in a like, no, we're doing this properly, this is evidence-based, we're manufacturing things properly. Like, we hear you, you're annoyed, you're tired, you don't want expensive pee. Some people still pay for expensive pee, but that's neither here nor there. Like, I think the disillusionment and fatigue has actually kind of informally raised standards, because we can talk about, and I just wrote an article on The Conversation about, like, the regulation of the supplement industry by the FDA in the States is still pretty much leaving it up to the manufacturers to be good people. Some are, many aren't. So I think it's interesting that the consumers, and then more and more research scientists and evidence people from the evidence-based community are providing supplements and being involved in that process, has kind of started to separate the wheat from the chaff. Where like, I can still buy the supplement with like the shiny label and the like grandiose claims and like the Mr. O of the day on it, or the powerlifter on it, or I can buy the one that's like going to give me studies and tell me exactly what's in it, and like will have the QR code which will tell me exactly how it's been formulated, etc. So I think like a pretty significant pathway has emerged from the fact that like we've all fell hook, line, and sinker for like well over a century worth of dubious claims around products.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. So now we're moving into kind of the modern times, which we've addressed a number of times and talked about, and I think people are familiar with it because we're in it. But I have a question, and maybe I'm jumping the shark, so please do halt me. And if there's another branch of this history we want to go down, I'm curious about what we think the future might be. And I don't mean like 30 years from now, but I mean maybe in the next 5 to 10 years. Like, what are some of the trends and directions that things are going?
It
Breast
seems to
milk. Sorry, Ben, you go.
yeah. Well, listen, if the big companies like Nestle and Abbott haven't made a synthetic breast milk yet, because we still have formula.
Ooh, Nestle. Are you saying chocolate breast milk is the future, Ben?
I'm not even going down that rabbit hole because it's just going to end up getting me in trouble. So no comment. But I think, in my opinion, I think we are still in the post DMAA, post ephedra era, where I think the place where a formulator has the largest ability to move the needle in terms of feel and sensation and getting something from a product that you can recognize, I do think it's still in stimulants, and I think it will remain in stimulants for the foreseeable future. Either stimulant derivatives or something with nootropics, because I think that's really, in my opinion, that would define our time. Because it's still interesting. It's broad enough that it's outside of fitness. You don't have to just be in fitness. It kind of intersects with the whole biohacking concept where, people are doing that stuff. They're microdosing psychedelics and stuff to try to improve efficiency and productivity. And like celebrities are doing stuff with, nootropics and all that stuff. So I really think that's going to continue to build out until it gets to some type of ceiling. I think it's very hard to say what the next step will be. I think that's actually fascinating to think about. But I don't think supplements are ever going to go away, but I almost think they could be threatened more and more as time goes on, because pharma is definitely getting more interested and involved in the space and definitely competing in the space more. And then I also think the more likely thing is people to try to start doing things with, CRISPR and modification that goes further in the direction of pharma than it does supplements. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I think the best answer I can give now is probably it'll continue to be more stimulant based, more nootropic based, just because they've done such a good job now up to this point of scheduling, quote, anabolics and anabolic derivatives and andro derivatives, that there's just really no space to exist without becoming a drug, as we know with SARMs. Like, that's why SARMs, not supplements, they're research chemicals.
Yeah, I thought SARMs were going to blow up a lot more in the supplement space, and it seems they have not, for exactly that reason. But no, you did a fantastic job answering my question, and it sounds like it's a brave new world of experience modification, which I think is very interesting and not wholly surprising when you think about it.
Eric, I was going to say that I think Ben nailed it. I think from a marketing standpoint, I kind of feel like we're about to experience another inversion. And what I mean when I say that, I think there's been an integration. So let me back up actually a little bit. I think unlike the 50s, 60s, and 70s, I was joking, but there was that strong knowledge asymmetry, right? There wasn't the power of networks. There wasn't the voice of the consumer couldn't be amplified via other consumers, via third party or other places, forums where people are talking about their own subjective experiences. So you'd have this intense marketing that can make these hyperbolic claims, and there'd be no ramifications because the supplement industry or the different supplement companies have essentially all the power. They're the ones marketing to you, so it's top down. So let's say you buy that like fartastic protein powder, you consume it and you train for the next 3 to 6 months and you don't get results. Your ability to communicate your own subjective experience to others is vastly limited compared to the modern times of social media. So you have a lot of financial pressure, incentives, marketing by the companies, basically convincing people, as Ben said, getting over the hump. So people, all they see are the success stories. They don't see the graveyard of people that experience nothing whatsoever. In that way, you're essentially allowed to operate any which way you want. And so it's kind of the Wild West. Then over time, what starts happening, we have, as Eric alluded to, like the forums and everything else, social media. And really, I think that was the change in that asymmetry, is that some voices were amplified that brought largely positive changes. We're talking about, flexible dieting, a lot of other things where norms were challenged that were basically came from tradition. So marketing that then became a tradition within the community of like, use this, or like use this amount of meals, or these are the foods you need to eat, or these are the supplements you need to take. And so a little bit more rigor when it came to the scientific practice entered a little bit. And then you saw people that gave a shit about that weren't, critique of capitalism, number one, that weren't financially motivated. So you have someone maybe like a Greg Nuckols, like sharing the examine.com, and then it being on the forum, or it's on Reddit, or it's someone else on YouTube makes a video about it. And so now it becomes commonplace that essentially if you're going to make the hyperbolic claims, you'll get called out, because there are people in the forums, as Eric and myself spoke to, they'll call you out on your bullshit. And if you want to have this intellectual battle, you better be backing up your claims. And so that kind of went a little bit the way of the dinosaurs, the extreme hyperbolic claims. And this totally depends on what space we're talking in. I think what Ben said is super fascinating, though, Eric, is that you have, I would describe, there's different slices, there's intersections therein. You kind of have bodybuilding, so lifters. I would say you have the health-oriented space, so optimizing health. And that's a little bit of like futurism, or people that are more, when they talk about a holistic practice, like they want to feel better, all those things. You have lifters that want to get them gains. And then I think a third slice that's becoming bigger to Ben's point, is kind of the Joe Rogan effect. Like, I'm joking when I say that, but I call it like alternative science, right? It's alternative practices where like nootropics kind of enter that, or like we joke where I said someone was in charge of this big company of human optimization, where it's like we're doing away with mainstream media or like mainstream science, and we're kind of delving into our own thing. But I think it's going to fall back on our head. That's getting around to the point, is that I think basically you have to be able to back up your bullshit currently in 2021 to an extreme level. You could get by with slick marketing, to Ben's point. There's some companies, they'll have lab in the name, or they're science adjacent. So it's become now, because anything that enters the public space eventually becomes absorbed and then kind of retrofitted. And we see that when it comes to science and knowledge. So you have to be science adjacent now. You can't speak out of turn. But I think the inversion that will probably happen in the future is that the consumer will no longer be able or savvy enough to differentiate on a granular level, actually like legitimate science being conducted, or people with integrity. Or to Ben's point, like I hear Ben to me reminds me like,
It's already happening.
Yeah.
That's already happening.
Yeah. No,
that's
for sure.
The irony of mentioning that on this podcast, Omar, is that we are stepping into the niche of, hey, there is a certain level of granularity that's not realistic for the general, even science-interested public to have. So we need science communicators. Hence, us bringing on folks like Conor and Ben and having a podcast that centers around that. So I think you're 100% right.
No,
You said this perfectly, though, and I think we can all define a very distinctive period in our own journey through fitness or through the supplement industry that would echo exactly what you said, is with Bill Phillips, he was science adjacent. He actually had a science degree. He was well educated, but he was better at marketing. He wrote articles where you thought you were being educated, you thought you were learning, but they were clever marketing. They ended in a pitch or a call to action. And again, I think there's wakes of the 90s that we haven't outlived. And I think there's still the Bill Phillips effect. And again, one of the things that they talk about in this Sups movie is, or I should say that I sort of gleaned from watching the movie, is the 90s also defined the partnership of a really bright scientist and a really bright marketer, because that's what Metrics was. Metrics was Dr. Scott Connolly, Bill Phillips. And, for people who aren't familiar with Dr. Connolly, he really was ahead of the time with protein metabolism and stuff like that. And if you fast forward a decade later, another really bright scientist, Patrick Arnold, is the person who brought one of the most popular andro derivatives to the market. And ironically, he was more like Elon Musk than he was a marketer. He brought a product, and the product spoke for itself. He didn't really have heavy marketing. But I think when I say we're living in the wake of that, is it does seem that the most effective brands now are the ones who have that that combination of both. Even if they don't come out as being loud about being good scientists, they have solid formulas, and their marketing is so effective, and it's so it passes so easily as education, even if it isn't.
Absolutely, that's really well said. And I think this has been a really cool winding pathway that's led us to the modern times. And I'm sensitive to the fact that Dr. Heffernan is it's late for him, folks.
It's true.
In his part of the world, we started this podcast at 9 p.m. So I want to be respectful of his sleep schedule and also both of your times. And I just want to say, is there anything now at this point that either of you feel is an important add to the conversation before we close it out?
I think just the need for enlightened skepticism and the research behind where you're getting your supplements, because, you know, the ones who are upfront, the ones who talk about their processes, the ones who let you behind the curtain are often the ones that you should go towards, rather than the ones who are saying Mr. O took this. I think the ones who are legitimate are really anxious to show that they are legitimate. And I say this as someone who opens, you know, my lectures on supplements by showing the class the 2 PowerPoint slides of all the things I've taken, and then the photo of me on the bodybuilding stage and saying, do you think all of that amounted to that? And the answer is, do you even lift? Of course. But I just think that, you know, we've all been sucked in by spurious claims. I think the ones who are really trying to be legitimate and are legitimate are very open about the processes, are very open about what they're selling and why they're doing it. And, you know, much like Omar saying, you know, we could sell this and make a lot more bang for our buck, but we're given both sides of it. I think the ones who are legitimate are showing they're legitimate. I think there is a need to be skeptical about ones who are still relying on marketing from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, which is shut up, the big lifter took it, take your medicine. I just think enlightened skepticism is going to be more and more important in the next few years.
Well said.
I don't think I can add anything to that other than scan the goddamn QR codes, people.
That's what I was going to come back to, is that even in our space where people are about that evidence-based life, and they do say, like, when we have the outtake surveys, and we ask people, like, hey, what's it? It's like, well, hey, man, your third-party testing, that's real important. It's like, have you ever scanned our QR code just to make sure, independently verify from the third party that we use it?
Trust you guys. You just have to listen. The people who buy elemental formulations know that Ben Esgro and Omar Yusuf got their packs. They don't need to scan the codes. You know what I'm saying? Heck, you should just take the codes off. I mean, you guys are good folks, you know?
This is, to be serious for a second, I do think, to add on top of what Conor said, I think it was perfectly put, but if you want those companies to stay around, you have to support them. Like, there is always a war going on between, quote, good and evil, or however you want to define it, black hat, white hat, whatever, gray hat. And I think, you know, I think oftentimes people step back from the industry and they say, oh, they have a company, everything's fine. But you're constantly in competition, and you're in competition with marketing, and oftentimes very effective marketing that, you know, is a lie, but you can't necessarily compete as well with it because maybe you're not as willing to go to that place of lying to do it. So I think really what I'd say is, if there are companies around that you really believe in and that you know are doing the right things and are making that effort to be more transparent than necessary, please continue to give them your support. Because certainly that's definitely a self-survival thing, but I want to see the industry, I want to see that part stay in the industry too, because sometimes it does concern me that, man, a lot of this marketing is really, really effective, and oftentimes it's very disingenuous. And I worry that the average consumer can't see through that unless they hang around for a decade or more and they get educated enough to be able to see through that. So, yeah, it's just a friendly request to keep supporting the companies who are making that extra effort to do the right thing.
Don't worry, buddy. The cultists got your back. They're not going to scan the codes because they trust you, but they will keep having the codes present in their home that they don't scan. So
we're going to leave them there no matter what.
Oh, yeah.
Good man. And that's why they trust you. But yeah, I just want to thank both of you guys. Thank you, Dr. Heffernan. Thank you, Ben, for being back on. I actually don't even know which. I think we're on Connor's 4th appearance.
Yeah, I think so.
Yep, and Ben probably 4th as well. Yeah. So Omar's definitely putting the wrong fingers up in each case, but that's okay. Because he's just throwing hand signs. He's just
Emoji.
He's just throwing emojis and gang signs at people that he's not aware of. Just out in Canada, accidentally signaling different criminal gangs throughout the world.
Large scale war, yeah, gangland wars.
That's right. That's good. But thank you, folks, for hanging around till the end. This has been an enlightening episode for me, I can say personally. So I'm sure you guys have taken a lot away as well. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to my partner in crime.
Well,
Mr. Yusuf.
Hey, I just want to say I appreciate both of you, Connor, Ben, for enlightening, as Eric alluded to, the audience. I will say I kind of have to scrap now, Connor, to be honest, our 2022 Elemental marketing plan, because as you said, most people say trusted by Mr. O. And we were going to say the same thing because everyone thinks like, oh, trusted by Mr. O, Mr. Olympia. But for us, it'd just be like trusted, used by Mr. O, and Mr. O would be me. And we would kind of just like blur out, enhance the physique a little bit. And then, it would be like a small lowercase O, not like the big O. So it's not like, oh, Mr. O, like Mr. Olympia. We could see how that could be confusing for some. That's largely their interpretation or misinterpretation. So we'll change that. Thank you for bringing it to our attention. I suppose we can try and course correct or what have you. We'll make sure in the description to link Dr. Heffernan if anyone's interested. I mean, he's going to be coming on for a 4th or 5th time. If you enjoyed this episode, if you made it all the way to the end, if you are the loyal and faithful cult member, it's weird that we mentioned 5 because we have a rating review system where we can appease the computer gods by leaving that rating review on iTunes. It's out of 5. I'm going to be honest with you. The most common review, 5 stars. I'll leave it up to your personal discretion. I will say that from a personal standpoint, if you leave less than 5 stars, it's just probably not worth your time. It seems like a low time investment, kind of like standing in that line at the Mr. Olympia to get a shitty stack of protein samples. So go ahead, leave your rating review. We leave it up to your discretion, and we'll catch every single one of you in that next episode every single Monday.